Compliance with the performance requirements can be achieved by, or can only be achieved by, complying with the DTS provisions or formulating an alternative solution which complies with the performance requirements or is shown to be at least equivalent to the DTS provisions, or a combination of A and B. So you can combine them, but you must do one of those to satisfy the performance requirements, and thus the BCA. Flexibility in compliance. The flexibility in clause A.5 provides two pathways to demonstrate compliance of alternative solutions. One is to develop an alternative solution to meet performance requirements, or developing an alternative solution to at least equate to deem to satisfy provisions. So an alternative solution with DTS provisions may be using fire engineering to work out that a different type of wall will have the same resistance to the spread of fire or the same FRL as a prescribed way or a prescribed system or building element. To do it with the performance requirements, you need to look at the specific performance requirements and then formulate an alternative solution. If it's measurable, particularly if the deemed to satisfy is measurable, sometimes it's easy to go down the route of Route 2, but if it's not measurable, you'd probably move up to Route 1 there and look at the performance requirements to try and formulate something that satisfies that. Okay, flexibility and compliance. Either of these options can be explored to establish the most appropriate pathway for a particular alternative solution. A decision regarding the most appropriate pathway may be influenced by views of the certifying authority. Now, the certifying authority is going to be a private certifier or building certifier or the local authority. It'll depend on whether you have, if you don't have private certifiers where you are in your jurisdiction, it's always going to be the local authority. If you do have private certifiers, it'll be the private certifier or the local authority. So developing an alternative solution. Okay, in order to incorporate alternative solutions into designs, practitioners need to understand what the BCA requires and why. This knowledge is generally acquired from qualifications and relevant experience. Without knowledge, practitioners will not be able to maximise the benefits of the BCA. When developing alternative solutions, it must be understood that certain DTS provisions are based on assumed inclusion of related DTS. Therefore, the relationship between the proposed alternative solution and its effect on other components of the design must be considered. So what that means is there's oftentimes an interconnection between the requirements of the BCA. It's more pronounced in Volume 1 with fire safety, where you turn around and you can try to take out sprinkler systems in a building, but at the same time as taking sprinkler systems out in E10, you're going to start looking at access and egress in Part D of the BCA and smoke and fire tenability in Part C. So you can't just look at an alternative solution in isolation. You have to look at the effect of it on all of the performance requirements that it may affect. So an example, maximum travel distances to an exit presented in clause D1.4 are taken to be based in part on the assumed performance of early hazard indices as required under C1.10. Therefore, if the requirements of C1.10 are lessened, the suitability of travel distances may be influenced. So you need, as I say, to look at all of the relevant clauses that may be affected by an alternative solution. When developing an alternative solution, it should be discussed with the certifying authority before lodging an application for approval. Discuss the scope of documentation intended to be provided and the qualifications of expert advisors. In Queensland, and I'm not sure about other states, but in Queensland, if you're doing an alternative solution on any fire safety system in anything than a detached 1A dwelling, Queensland Fire and Rescue are also a referral agency, and it has to go to them for their opinion. So the certifying authority is not only the certifier, in some cases it's also Queensland Fire and Rescue Services. It'll just depend on the class of building and what the alternative solution is that's proposed. The certifying authority can then explain the scope of documentation it will need in order to be satisfied. The certifying authority must not be involved in the design of the alternative solution, as this could create a conflict of interest. However, it should be able to describe what is required for approval. So again, with the conflict of interest, the building certifier can't say, well, if you put a door there and you put a door there and you make this shorter and you make that longer, that'll comply. That's designing it. That's a conflict of interest. You really can only point out what the BCA clauses require, what distances, maximum distances are, and it's up to the designer to make it work. All practitioners need to be familiar with the content of building regulation systems in their state or territory, particularly regarding approval processes. If you're not familiar, contact the government department responsible for building regulation and seek their advice. So in Queensland, that's Department of Infrastructure and Planning, Building Codes Queensland. So they are very helpful and have a lot of useful information. So Building Codes Queensland, if you're not aware of them, look them up on the web and you will get a lot of information from them. So considering the effect on other parts of the design. Selecting appropriate performance requirements. When an alternative solution is proposed, it is necessary to select the appropriate performance requirements against which it will be assessed. This is known as the holistic approach. In some cases, this task will be easy, and in others, it will need to be the result of some consideration. The BCA provides a process for selection. Clause A010 of Volume 1 or Clause 1.0.10 of Volume 2 address this relationship. These clauses present a method that must be used to select which performance requirement must be met by a proposed alternative solution. So when we're looking at our ceiling height, we need to be looking at Clause 1.0.10 of Volume 2. In essence, Clause 1.0.10 requires identification of the DTS to be addressed by the alternative solution. Identification of the performance requirement in Section 2 that are directly relevant to the DTS. Identification of performance requirements from other parts of Section 2 that are relevant to the alternative solution or affected by the DTS provisions related to the alternative solution. So does everybody understand that and where to find that? Because that's going to set out the methodology in doing your alternative solution for the ceiling height. Okay? There's not, as far as it goes with an alternative solution in the context of what we're doing, it's not so much that there's a right or wrong answer, it's more that there's a process that you have to follow. And if you follow the process, that's what this is more about. It's more process-driven than outcome-driven for the purposes of the assignment. In real life, when you're out and about doing alternative solutions, it's highly going to be outcome-driven as well as process-driven because it needs to work. But for the purpose of the assignment, we're looking at following the correct processes. Okay, for example, think of the previous exercise we discussed regarding space between a window in a house and a boundary to allow natural light into a room. We accepted that a window could be a lesser distance than 900 mm to a boundary. However, a window is usually set into a wall. Can an external wall of a house be located close to a boundary? So that's the question. Does anyone have any comments on that? Can you set the wall closer to the boundary? Any comments on how you'd go about doing this? No? Okay, we'll keep going. So there's our little picture again. So performance requirement P2.3.1 requires protection of housing from the spread of fire. DTS clause 3.7.1.3 addresses distance between external walls and boundaries. In essence, external walls including openings such as windows located less than 900 mm from a boundary need to be of fire-resisting construction. Therefore, a proposal to locate a window less than 900 mm to an allotment boundary also needs to consider the construction of the surrounding wall. So it can be seen that a proposal to use performance P244 can be influenced by performance P2.3.1. So there's 2.3.1, spread of fire. So we're not only looking at light and ventilation, we're looking at the spread of fire here. Now, I'll go back to that one. So what you do here, if you're going to do an alternative solution to get the window closer to the boundary than 900 mm with the wall, what do you think has to happen to that window to comply? Or how would you treat that window in an alternative solution? Does anyone have a comment on that? No? Well, we'd need to fire rate the window. So the wall, for the external wall less than 900 mm in volume 2 of the BCA, it needs to have an FRL of 60-60-60. So that's a fire resistance of 60 minutes for structural adequacy, structural integrity and insulation. The window would have to have the same, although it wouldn't need structural adequacy, to just need integrity and insulation to stop the passage of heat and stop the passage of hot gas. So if you were going to do an alternative solution for that, that's what you'd be wanting to see. You'd want to see the wall was fire rated, the window was fire rated. You may not go with a fire rated window. You may decide to have drenching wall wetting sprinklers above the window. That's what your alternative solution would be looking at. So the ABCB has produced a guide to the Volume 1 that provides background information for the BCA. The guide may assist you in understanding the relationship between parts of the BCA and be of benefit in identifying appropriate performance requirements. So that's the guide to the BCA there. Now, if you go online and use the online BCA that the library has through the uni, you can access the guide to the BCA. And a lot of what's in the guide to the BCA, although it's for Class 2 to 9 buildings, some of that relates to Class 1s as well, particularly when you look at the classification and some of these other things. So it's there for you to use, so I'd say if you're interested, go and have a look at it. So that is the end of today's session. The key messages are that designers have a choice of two pathways when developing alternative solutions. Comply with the performance requirements, at least equate to the DTS provisions. When developing an alternative solution, hold preliminary discussions with a certifying authority to assess viability and take a holistic view of the content of the BCA. So that's pretty much should be the takeout from this, is how to go about doing your alternative solution on the ceiling if you haven't started. If you have started, it may give you a few ideas just to tweak it if you haven't done that. But definitely have a look at those parts that we mentioned. And this has been recorded and I'll put it up on the Moodle site. So if anyone wants to come back and have a look at it later, you're more than welcome to. So that's the end of the presentation. What I'd suggest, if people can't talk to me, if you don't have microphones or those sort of things, put some comments up on our Moodle page about the presentation, whether there's more information you'd like to see and whether you'd like these presentations to continue, because I'm quite happy to do them, but I just need to know what you guys would like to be seeing about it. So there you go. So that's the end of the presentation today.